Hey, everybody. My name's Amy Chester, and I'm the director of Rebuild by Design. How many people here are from New York City? Oh, almost all of you. So you'll probably recognize what we've been going through and our neighbors have been going through. And for those who are not from New York City, these are pictures of the 5 boroughs just from the past 2 years or so, basically since Hurricane Ida, of what's been happening with heavy downpours in the summertime. And this is DEP. So this is our city's map of the 2050 stormwater flooding with sea level rise. And it doesn't really look that extreme, but I can tell you that when we experience an event like that, it is very extreme in many, many, many neighborhoods. And it affects people's homes and their livelihoods, depending on where they live. What basically happens is the water comes down and it finds the lowest point within that community. And that lowest point could be somebody's home, it could be somebody's business, it could be the end of a street. And it really wreaks havoc for a number of hours until the sewer system can catch up. And this is what we're looking at as our 2100 sea level rise plus extreme stormwater flooding, and you can tell that it's happening everywhere. So this is a massive problem that we have in New York City to solve. And the city has been working on this issue for many, many years and has dedicated a lot of time and resources to it since Hurricane Ida, going back about 10 years for their cloudburst resiliency planning, all the way to the green infrastructure plan that's quite recent. And we at Rebuild by Design have also been working on this. Our organization is a nonprofit that's housed at NYU that works with communities and local governments to design and implement large-scale infrastructure to address climate hazards. And after Hurricane Ida, which was about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, the next day, we had an enormous amount of phone calls coming in from reporters, from elected officials, from other people who just wanted to understand what happened the night before. Many, many reporters started asking, oh, was the Hurricane Sandy dollars spent wrong? Oh, should we be taking away all the Hurricane Sandy dollars, that are left and putting it to this issue? And it was kind of a little bit eye-opening that there was so many people who have been reporting about climate change for a very long time and working in this space and had never really understood what could happen during rain. So it was an opportunity for us to say, wait a minute, there's been a lot of people who've been working on this and thinking about it. So about 2 weeks later, we released the anthology of ideas, which we call for shorthand Ideas for Ida. And we got 20 experts to write essays about what the city could do immediately. And then later on, it was followed by our second report towards a rainproof New York City. And that report was really created because in my conversations that day after, I was Googling green infrastructure and realizing that there are no images that we could use from around the world that looks like it belongs in New York City. So we wanted to create the, kind of give people an entry point in their imagination to see what it would look like if we actually worked very hard to transform our city into a sponge. So this image isn't coming out very well. It looks fine on my computer, but it's washed out. But we do a series of images to show what the different interventions could be like. And we always use this kind of cross section so people could understand that it could happen in a NYCHA building or, a tall building or a brownstone or a walk up or a hospital or a school or one family or multifamily small dwellings that everybody can play a role in this. And after that report, the city reached out to us and said, we want to work with you. So we've been working really closely with the city now for over a year, I believe, and just recently hosted a symposium together on rainproofing New York City. This was in March, and we had 16 agencies and many experts come and really roll up their sleeves and start talking about these issues. And we're going to continue that effort moving forward. So our goal, our shared goal, is to create a citywide housing migration program that addresses these issues of rain. Of course, that's not the only thing that the city is working on, where they're working on green infrastructure and expansion of sewers. But the one thing that we're trying to think about in the context of where we are here is that migration program for rain. So what does heavy rain mean for a place like New York City? We have these questions that we kind of ask ourselves quite often, and there's many more. Like, do we move our homes higher and vacate lower floors? Do we move residents out of basements, whether they're illegal or legal? It's still quite hazardous. Do we prohibit building in areas that used to be marshes, wetlands, lakes, and streams? And we're going to hear a lot about that today. Do we concentrate all our new development in areas of higher ground, which New York City is lucky to have that option? Do we bring back water, former rivers and streams and water bodies and do what's called daylighting to give space for more water? And do we start talking about whether or not we all can live in the places where we're living right now? And that is called many different things. As you know, from spending the past 3 days here, the city has been calling it housing choice recently. We like strategic relocation. No matter what it's called, it kind of doesn't matter because everybody knows what you are talking about. And the truth of the matter is that people are finally understanding that it might be something they have to consider on the spectrum of all the different types of infrastructure. And the big question is also, how do we make space for our neighbors? So when people are going to leave, they need a place to stay. And we think that that's really, really important, a key to making sure that communities have those options that are potentially nearby, and also make room for nature. We can't just make room for our neighbors without understanding that our neighbors and bigger and denser environments need more diverse ecology and need to have cleaner air and need to have, good opportunities for health and mental health. So what we want to talk about today is the differences between coastal infrastructure, coastal events that are leading to retreat and rain events that are leading to retreat, because they present different challenges and we haven't unpacked all of them. And would love to also hear what challenges you think it will be as we are embarking on this partnership together. Some of the challenges that the city's been talking about is how hard it's going to be when there's a checkerboard of places. So it might not be an entire neighborhood. It's more likely going to be 1 or 2 or 3 homes that spread out over a larger period. That there are ongoing hazards that make your home unsafe that people do not recognize like they do after a big event like Hurricane Sandy. These are like the slow moving hazards, and that very likely a lot of these places are not in a FEMA flood zone. So they have never been confronted with the opportunity to buy flood insurance or the mandate to buy flood insurance, and thinking about, how are we going to have these really hard conversations? So our focus is, how can we live with water? How can we make room for our neighbors? How do we make space for nature? And how do we work with communities who are the most impacted at the very beginning of this conversation? So we have a great panel today. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up, just one after the other, and then we will come back together to have a conversation. So we have Eric Sanderson from the New York Botanical Garden, Alan Cohn, who is filling in for Angela Licata today, and the one that's really behind a lot of this work, from the New York City DEP. We have David Erdman from the Pratt Institute and Rebecca Pryor from Guardians of Flushing Bay, all of which are amazing collaborators. So thank you for coming today.
That was great, Amy. Thank you for that introduction. When we look at New York City and we look at a picture like this from my book, Monohato, we tend to think that the built thing on the right is the normal state. But in fact, it isn't. For thousands of years, the normal state of this landscape was the green side, right? This is a landscape that wants to be forest, wants to be wetland, and that kind of landscape can adapt to climate resilience. That is a resilient landscape, and was for thousands of years and will be for thousands of years into the future. So the question for us is, how do we live in a landscape that wants to be a forest, wants to be wetlands, and have a city with 8.8 million people in it? The historical ecology provides a guide to that. By understanding the original topographic contours that were left through geological processes formed over thousands of years, and the ways those were filled with streams and wetlands. And I don't know if you can do the geolocation in your mind to the extreme flooding maps that Amy just showed, but most of the places that want to flood in the future are the places that also flooded in the past. And that there were ecosystems that were well adapted to manage that. After Hurricane Sandy, I was at a 3-day meeting about the effects of Hurricane Sandy on the city, and it was all bad news until the last talk on the 3rd day, which was by the salt marsh ecologist from Gateway National Recreation Area, and she was like, "Oh, actually the salt marshes did pretty well. They're actually much better now after the flood event. That's the way we need to be thinking about our city going forward. And why is that important? I know everybody has seen the Keeling curve before, particularly in this audience, but just think about if we decided as society 200 years ago that we were going to do this, that we were going to increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere by 50% over what it was. And all the work you would have to do to locate the carbon sources deep under the ground, to find mechanisms to pull them up above the ground, to then burn them and burn them for generations and generations, and to motivate more people to do it so that we're doing on a global scale, so that we actually do this impossible thing, which is actually change the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if you imagine such an enormous effort to do this thing, to change the natural world in such a fundamental way, well, you'll get the benefits of that, which is, increased temperatures, right? Because now you're trapping in all that excess heat because you've changed the atmospheric concentration of the entire world. And you're going to get, at least in the New York City context, more precipitation, more of these big rain events, of which Hurricane Ida was just the first suggestion of what the future it has in store. And it's because we did it. We pulled this off. And we've created an environment that we need to adapt for thousands of years. And the decisions that we're making right now will have such long-term consequences for not just the way we live in the city, but the way our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids live here. So in that context, I've been working with Alan and Rit at the DEP to do a very simple analysis, to take our maps of the historical ecology of the city, the past flooding, take the 311 calls and the current patterns of flooding in the city, the present flooding, so places we know are flooding, and then the future flooding from those stormwater resiliency maps that Amy showed you. So, and the logic is that if a place was wet 400 years ago, is still wet today, and is predicted to be wet 50 or 100 years from now, well, that's probably a place we need to be doing climate resilience action. We need to be adapting, some of which might include, what is it? We're migrating our housing migration. And so these are what the maps look like for a certain part of this, for a little bit of Queens and the Bronx and some of Manhattan, including where we are now. So the past historical ecology, which is freshwater wetlands, salt marshes, streams, beaches, and also some marine areas, because there's a lot of landfill in the city. The present patterns of flooding from the 311 calls, and then the future flooding. And if you lay all three of these things on top of each other, you get what we call a blue zone. And if all three of those conditions are true, that's the dark blue areas on this map. We analyze them using a version of the blocks of the city, the atomic blocks. So that's 10% of the atomic blocks are in the dark blue color on this map, or 17% of the land area of the city. So 17%. So keep that in your mind. Each of these data sets has its own issues. One of the issues with the 311 calls is they're not reported everywhere, right? There's, people don't live in the middle of Central Park or Prospect Park or at JFK Airport, so they don't call 311, and those calls are not recorded. So if you just look at the past and the future flooding, so taking our historical ecology and the stormwater resiliency maps and you overlay those, that's that medium blue color. And cumulatively, that adds up to 18% of the blocks of the city, or 24% of the land area. But then if you look at those stormwater resiliency maps that Amy showed, there's big gray areas that weren't analyzed, the parks and the airports and some other really important areas, the places that were on landfill. So if you look at just the historical ecology, that's 37% of the blocks and 38% of the area. So what this analysis suggests is that somewhere between a quarter and a third, give or take, of the city needs to change for climate resilience. Some of which might be a housing migration program, but there could be other sorts of things too. And Alan in particular will be talking about that in a minute. So just to make it a little bit more real, if we look at a couple of specific places, Casina Creek in Queens, or Rock Hollow Pond in Jamaica, or the Hole on the border between Brooklyn and Queens. These are all places that had streams and wetlands in the past, as you can see here. And if we do show you the blue zones, you can see that it's basically mapping those same areas. So it's locating in them, and even giving you a sort of a sense of the priority of them. These are also places that were heavily damaged during Ida, where people either lost a lot of property or lost their lives. So that's why they're of particular interest. So, I think the logic that's coming out of here is, of course, is if you're going to, in some ways restore nature to a large proportion of the city, and you want to have a city that's 8.8 million people, that implies you have to increase density in the safer places, right? If the goal is to have a city of 8.8 million people, which I'm not sure that is the goal, but if that's the goal, or a city of 9 million or 10 million people, if that's the goal, well, then we're just going to have to increase density. So, and that is also an opportunity to deal with the other thing that is such a chain and such a lock on the city, which is our broken transportation system that depends on private cars. And of course, the other major thing is that there are these huge environmental justice concerns. It won't be surprise anyone in this room to know that the people that are living in the lowest places on landfill, which is mostly garbage and toxic waste in many cases, are the poorest people, the people with the least voices. Typically, this is just an expression of the discriminations that have happened for centuries in our country. As you can see in Newtown Creek, this is a picture of Newtown Creek in 1931. And if you overlay, say, the NYCHA properties, the New York City housing properties, you'll see about 50% of them tend to be in low-lying areas, mostly because those were the spaces the city owned at the time it was building public housing in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, because everywhere else that was on the upland had already been built on and was in private hands. So this is, they wanted to build more public housing. These were the places that public housing could be built, but they've also, by that same logic, put people in the way of future flooding. So we need to envision new ways of doing this, right? And the city is doing a lot of work, but I really think that this is a task that falls upon all of us who care about the future of New York City. And we have a platform called visionmaker.nyc, which is an ecological democracy tool to help us imagine that, so that we can all together work, the skeptical, the intrepid, the creative, and the tree, to imagine the future of New York City. Because I really believe nature will save this city when we take nature seriously in our city planning. And that means using the historical ecology as a guide, enlisting vision makers from across the city to help out, and to take climate change not only as a threat to our city, but as an opportunity to change our city, to make it a better place for people and for nature to thrive into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sanderson. Definitely have been, following the cues in terms of learning from nature and taking what we understand from the past to design for the city of the future. And I also am encouraged by the opportunity that comes with that. One thing we certainly know is that we can't put everything back where it was. Hopefully there are some opportunities. We're going to talk a little bit about daylighting, but even that takes a different form, right, than what the river or the stream used to look like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that DEP is doing, that our interagency partners are doing. So talking a lot about the good work from my colleagues around the city. First off, as we well know, New York City is highly impervious. The red areas are not soaking up much rain. So you have this combination of increasing rainfall, increasing intensity of rainfall, falling on surfaces that do very little to soak it up. And even then, when you do have these extreme rain events, for the areas that are permeable, there is a limit, right, to how much can be absorbed by the ground, how much can be absorbed by the sewer system. So we have to think about the layers of how we can optimize the sewer system, how we can optimize stormwater capture above the ground. And then when everything is completely at capacity, how do we design our city so that it can either flood safely, convey the water to places that it can be safely stored, or perhaps in the areas that are now developed, do we have to consider moving away from having those areas developed and use them for stormwater management? Oops. So as I already mentioned, we have this backbone of stormwater management, which is the sewer system. We still rely on it to keep our streets dry. But again, you can build your system bigger to a certain extent, but even then there will be a storm that exceeds the design capacity, especially with climate change. You have increasing probability of that. Green infrastructure, I'll talk a lot about. That's using nature-based systems in many cases to absorb runoff from those highly impervious areas. We also have our cue from the Pluvial program, which started in the 90s in Staten Island, which is using nature-based systems and wetlands for naturally draining the streets instead of just using sewers. And then increasingly, the green infrastructure program has been mostly about retrofits, but increasingly we're also looking to include green infrastructure and stormwater management upfront in development on private property and in the right of way. And finally, I'll talk about our Cloudburst program, which is modeled off of our collaboration with Copenhagen, where we're seeing how we can leverage the tools in our toolbox and add to them so that we're thinking about our streets and our open spaces in particular as places to essentially convey and store water when everything else is overwhelmed. Oops, keep doing that. So first, on the green infrastructure program, one of the exciting parts about green infrastructure is that it's very scalable. And a lot of the progress we've seen, you see here, the over $1 billion encumbered with $1 billion budget over the next 10 years. This is all recent progress. And each of these dots represent our green infrastructure assets. We have over 12,000 assets, almost 13,000 assets at this time. You'll notice the geographic distribution. A lot of these are concentrated in areas that experience combined or contribute to combined sewer overflows. So that's a mix of rain and sewage spilling into New York Harbor. So as much as we can take runoff out of the system before it gets in there, the less chance it has of spilling into the harbor as combined sewage. However, there's still opportunity beyond these areas. A lot of the assets are located in environmental justice areas, but we have opportunity to expand beyond that to affect the people that are most affected by flooding. So green infrastructure takes many forms. The majority of the assets that I just described are rain gardens, like the one shown on the top here. We have over 11,000 right-of-way assets constructed or in construction. But as you build more and more, of course, your opportunities become less in those spaces. And so where can you expand? So we're looking at, or we are building larger median projects. We're also expanding into the street itself, particularly with porous concrete and surfaces that don't necessarily have the same features in terms of the vegetation, but have a similar function in terms of being able to infiltrate water into the ground. And so we've constructed approximately 80,000 square feet of permeable pavement, but a lot more is in the pipeline all over the city. Contracts and procurement for over 130,000 square feet of permeable pavement, one that's in design for over 950,000 square feet. So again, the scalability of green infrastructure systems is really exciting. In addition to that, we have our public property retrofits, 190 projects in parks, schools, NYCHA, and other locations, with 126 more in design. And finally, private property. We've contributed $14 million for 34 private property grants, like the green roof shown here at the Brooklyn Grange in Sunset Park. And again, as we move forward, we have our unified stormwater rule, which is requiring that properties implement stormwater management upfront in the design process. It's also a green first strategy. So the rule prefers vegetated retention first. And if a property can't do a vegetated retention project, we still want retention strategies like stormwater capture, tanks, and reuse. And so again, we have this combination of retrofits and upfront work that can gradually green our city more and more. So we've seen this map a few times now. This is, as others have described, what could potentially happen if you have a rainstorm affecting all parts of the city at once. We know that's not likely, but similar to the FEMA maps, they're showing the risk of an event of that size affecting that particular part of the system. And as soon as we develop these maps, actually, I think I sent Dr. Sanderson a note saying, looks like these closely align with the historical waterways. It was not a big surprise that that would happen. But if you look in places like Southeast Queens on the bottom left corner there, you see these clear lines emerge. So again, in a extreme rain event, water, as we've heard, is going to want to follow the historical pathways. We can't necessarily dig up what was there. We will talk about daylighting, and I will bring in mention an example in a second. But as much as possible, we want to see what we can do within the built environments as well to reduce runoff into the system. Quick time check. Okay, so I'll wrap up with a couple more slides. So again, this builds off of existing systems. We're not, reinventing the wheel here, but we more and more want to look at green infrastructure and conveyance as a system. So you have your first line of defense. Well, your first line of defense, as I mentioned, is really the sewer system. But even before then, you absorb as much as you can. Then as much as possible, where there's residual flooding after the sewer has captured everything, after the green infrastructure has captured everything, what can you do to convey water to places where it can be safely stored? And that can be underground, it can be above ground, it can be in our streets. We're, again, taking inspiration from places around the world on what this can look like. And we have a couple of projects that are in the queue in New York City. We have the pilot projects in purple in Southeast Queens, which includes the basketball court that we always show, which can fill up with rain during a heavy rain event. And then we have the newly announced neighborhoods throughout the city where we're going to use clustered green infrastructure type projects to mitigate some of the local flooding that occurs when the design capacity of the sewer is exceeded. And that's what this looks like. This is one of the examples near the New York Hall of Science in Corona Flushing Meadows Park. That location has received a lot of flooding, and we won't necessarily be able to eliminate that flooding, but as much as possible, we can reduce the runoff that is getting into the park and affecting the nearby neighborhood by combining our systems. So infiltrating what we can, and then conveying that runoff that's infiltrating into the ground into places that it can be stored below the surface and above the surface. And lastly, just very quickly, I will mention the Tibbetts Brook daylighting project. This shows the historical stream that ran from what is now Van Cortlandt Park into the Harlem River. Again, this is a situation where we can't necessarily dig up the historical waterway, but we have an opportunity in the railway, the CSX railway, to connect once again hydrologically the historical waterway to the Harlem River. And so this is a really exciting opportunity. It's mostly focused on and funded because we have the regulations in place and regulators that are working with us on Clean Water Act requirements and expanding the definition of green infrastructure so that we're encouraging these types of creative solutions. And so my colleague Amy Motsney here in the audience could tell you a lot more about Tibbetts Brook if you want to learn more. But with that, I will pass it off to our next speaker. Thank you.
How do you advance on this with the arrows? Okay, all right. Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be here to share a few thoughts about the Center for Climate Adaptation at Pratt. It's exciting to be in a room where these concerns that are facing us over the next decade are being hashed out in New York City and beyond. I'm going to talk a little bit about the living with water component of this and what I call retreat, which is really emphasizing the reworking and retreating the land that we have. I'll share a little bit about the center, a couple different models, and then a couple ending thoughts. We're the newest center at Pratt. We're partnered with Singapore University of Technology and Design and Pace University, and this brings together a consortium of disciplines from art and design to environmental business and law, technology, engineering, and science. We're focused on how to adapt. We're not so concerned with how to stop. So how do you live with 6 meters of tidal action? How do you live with pluvial action? Over 50% of the fastest growing areas on the planet are on islands or have islands within their borders, and islands often can't retreat, and they're subjected to the wicked triplet of land scarcity, water scarcity, pluvial, and coastal inundation. This bucks against the planetary binary of continents and oceans. For us, it's really about this space and the vulnerability and opportunities within it, as they are sure to develop. It also houses about 1/10 of the world's population globally on islands across the archipelagos. We're focused mostly on two, the Malay Archipelago and the Northeast Atlantic Archipelago, which bring together New York City and Singapore, some of their similarities and differences. These are big economic and policy decision makers. They're in dense areas. They have complex geopolitical structures that don't behave like water. They have underlying geological structures, which we've been hearing about, as well as historic settlement patterns that went to these regions because of their hydrology and vulnerability. We've largely been looking at Governor's Island. This is an area of rapid development and discussion in New York City. It is an island. It's a detached island. It is very vulnerable. In our 3 years on the island with our house and now as a core partner for the climate exchange, have offered us and our faculty and students an opportunity to debate some of the differences between the lowland, upland, reclaimed areas and historic parts of the island. In Singapore, we're looking at some of the dynamics in Southeast Asia and how Singapore relates back to Malaysia and the Johor region, looking specifically at the stretch between the Kelong River and Changi Airport, an area called the East Region or the Long Island region. We've been bringing students to Singapore to work with our colleagues at SUTD, looking at nature-based retention systems that have altered buildings, looking at buildings in these risk zones to try to understand how they might be preserved and developed, surveying these properties, shooting footage of them, and trying to understand how, when the lease runs out on the dam in Malaysia, gray water and blue water capacity can be bolstered in Singapore, which has the benchmark of 50% water independence as an island from the mainland, which is more significant than New York. So this is, it's really a game of what can you do in buildings to look, in addition to cloudburst models, at absorbance. So we've applied some of that to Governor's Island, looking at specifically the area of Nolan Park, which is probably the least vulnerable. It's more in the upland, and asking questions about how a building core could contribute to this. We took a cross section of 3 different buildings in the Nolan Park area and are looking at renovating them and altering them by cracking them open to produce water capture drums. You're seeing these 3 projects. The white areas are the retaining areas, and the clear plastic is the existing house. So this is pretty complicated. You have conservation issues. You have potential energetic issues in this region in addition to water that could be explored. And assembly issues. How do you get in here and crack these buildings open? These are conceived as on-site robotically manufactured water drums that filter water and purify it to offset the combined sewer system. So this is kind of turning buildings into aquifers, if you will, or things that could retain and absorb, as opposed to just shedding and pushing back and overloading the water system. The longer term idea is that these three buildings could be understood as being able to be chained together into a bigger infrastructure that could have a greater impact on the existing sewer systems in Governor's Island to both purify and diminish the loading on that system as a kind of model that could be explored across the island and across other parts of the tri-state area by kind of amplifying that as a suburban model. There's about 1.5 million square feet of underused land on the island in many zones, and you've seen other maps susceptible to this kind of thinking across the tri-state area. The second model I'll share is a vertical model. This is in Hong Kong, which is the most concentrated density on the planet. This is also part of the Malay archipelago. So you get extreme juxtapositions of urban densification and nature. Again, amongst the 9 cities, this is the most highly concentrated. That gives it a great carbon footprint, but a lot of challenges for restoring its aquaculture and how to live with that rapidly urbanizing southern edge. We were asked to explore this southwest area in Cyberport, which is a reclaimed land park. It connects to larger arteries of recreation, as well as a historic village, which fishes, lives on, and illegally occupies a lot of these CSOs for part of their livelihood. This is the biggest freshwater area of Hong Kong, where the British used to go for freshwater, and has massive pluvial inundation coming straight off the peak. This is a huge topographic section that hits this area, as well as being vulnerable to storm surges. And so it really represents that dynamic that you see in urban archipelagos and the kind of failures of the existing system and beautiful successes of how it's currently ritualized by the existing population and the tension of how that might work as a development zone. So we're proposing here to reverse reclaim. We're cutting into reclaimed area, as well as capturing some of the pluvial inundation. So you get those two flows kind of forcing different forms of habitat that we've tried to look at, both in terms of aquaculture and human culture through these mixed softer to harder filtering landscapes that kind of come out of the building. And this jacks the building up. So there is within this zone, the idea of the lower floors being sacrificial, putting the primary public assets up higher, as well as the infrastructural assets even up higher than that, as well as a rain screen that in this case is a literal rain screen with a coconut mat medium that absorbs and filters water as it goes back into the system. So a couple concluding thoughts on retreat, maybe some things that we might want to think about as an academically based research center. Innovation technically doesn't introduce anything new. It's remixing the parts. And part of what we're trying to explore and advocating for is how do you alter these existing resources, partly because that would limit displacement. So how do you retreat that area? And part of this is awareness, stop bridging and tunneling, live with the reclamation you have and make use of it or daylight it. These practices are volatile, and in Asia, more than North America or New York City, have historic practices and futures that have led to pretty gross inequities, and a lot of the acute symptoms we saw in Cyberport, as well as a lot of the protests in Hong Kong, revolve around these ideas of land use. I don't think we've seen that level of social action around it in New York City or disposition. Part of that's the inequities and the cheapness of just moving the land around. Part of it's our history and proposals in the Bay, and possibly our future that would reinforce that kind of thinking. And so against that, we're really advocating for, how do you build island capacity? How do you restore that? How do you study that? How do you become stewards of this kind of a region and mix development with nature-based solutions? A second prong is visualization. This was a workshop many of the colleagues in the room were involved in, where we used artificial intelligence to kind of rapidly visualize design ideas around pluvial and daylighting areas, as well as retention across 3 areas of New York City with community partners. And so, of course, this has all of the great dynamic of those discussions, the Post-its, the sketching that you see, but also the kind of horrors and beauties of what this might look like if you give it to an artificial intelligence engine and you have one day to think about that, right? So you get these concepts and they come out in high resolution. What does that sponginess look like in Hollis? Which, you know, has an impact on students' consciousness, had an impact in terms of forging agreements for us with partners in both India and Chile, and opportunities to work on those sites in the coming years. As an educator, I can't end without emphasizing enough, getting students out and into the field, particularly in design practices, is critical to our curriculum at Pratt. This is a walk Edgar Westerhoff gave the other day. So using those areas, talking about those vulnerabilities is important. And our international programming has intersected with 5 of the 7 largest archipelagos. Most recently in Patagonia, this is an island that sees 6 meters of tidal shift every day, as well as being one of the areas of the largest rainfall in all of Chile. And so getting students into that watershed, into those pluvial zones, and understanding how to retreat it and how retreat could be ritualized culturally and from a design perspective, I think is important. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Pryor. I'm the executive director at the Guardians of Flushing Bay, and I'm going to serve as sort of a case study for what we've been talking about, and then we'll focus more specifically on the work that we've been doing around cultural daylighting. So first, I'll just ground us in place a little bit and talk about where Flushing Bay and Flushing Creek are. We're located in multiple sewer sheds, so the Bowery Bay sewer shed and Tallman Island sewer shed, which just means, you know, where the water flows through the sewers, and then it goes to Tallman Island wastewater treatment plant or Bowery Bay wastewater treatment plant. We're also in a big floodplain. I mean, my eye was looking to everyone's maps to find Flushing Bay and Flushing Creek, but you can really see where the flooding is happening. This is a 2100 map. We're also kind of form the foundation and outline of Flushing Meadows Corona Park, so the 4th largest park in the city. The source of Flushing Creek starts at the southern end of the park and moves northward and empties out into Flushing Bay. And then who stewards this place? Who's Guardians of Flushing Bay? So we were started by dragon boaters. Dragon boating is a very popular sport in northern Queens. 20 people, shallow canoe, you race them. Maybe you know about it from the festival that happens in Meadow Lake every year. Many, if not all of those dragon boaters practice 7 months out of the year, some every day of the week in Flushing Bay. So those dragon boaters came together and to local artists. This is Cody Herman, a social practice artist who focuses on Flushing Creek. She's sitting on the water quality towels that she made. Red means don't touch the water. You can see that the towel that Cody's sitting on is predominantly red. And that's based in real data from water quality in Flushing Creek. And they also reached out to local residents and park users and folks who maybe weren't necessarily connected to the water already, didn't have access to a boat, didn't get down to Flushing waterways for many reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, but really care about the health of their neighborhoods and their own health of their families. Who do we serve? We really focus on the folks who have the greatest barriers to accessing a healthy environment. We understand those to be perpetuated by systemic inequities, like that kind of form around gender, race, income, immigration status, and those are concentrated in particular areas. So this is just a snapshot of EPA's environmental justice screen, and I just took the one that's around, or the index that's around hazardous waste proximity. And you can see where a lot of that hazardous waste is congregating, and it's really in the neighborhoods of Flushing, Corona, East Elmhurst, and College Point. And so that's really our focus in the area around Flushing waterways. And that's just, I took one snapshot. That basically is the case for all of the EJ indexes. It's really in those neighborhoods where folks are in the 85th and above percentile in the nation. So key challenges. I talked about the sewer system. The image I showed before was on a dry weather day. This is on a wet weather day. So we talked about combined sewer overflows. You can see sort of actually, I kind of want to call out Corinne, who made this map. Go, Corinne. You can see it segregated into different colors. The colors correspond to the pipe that it dumps into the waterway, where it dumps into the waterway. And, you know, Flushing Bay and Flushing Creek receive about 2 billion gallons of raw sewage and polluted stormwater every year. Those numbers are based on 2008 rainfall numbers. Corinne actually did some good mapping that showed in 2018, that number more than doubles. So what we found in that process was about 5 billion gallons. It's also in located in a historic coal ash dump. So F. Scott Fitzgerald's Valley of Ashes in the Great Gatsby, that is Flushing Waterways. It is the Valley of Ashes because of this massive coal ash dump that used to be there. It was then transformed for the 1939 and 1964 World's Fairs. And that transformation, it was during the era of Robert Moses. And so it means that the park is surrounded by a highway system, which makes it difficult to access the waterways and to access the park in general. It's flood prone. And then, I don't know what's going on there, but also, I talked about historic planning. This is more modern day planning. This is an area of massive speculation. Some of these examples, like the Special Flushing Waterfront District, are approved. Some of them, as is part of actually the Special Willets Point District, and then some of them are proposed. And so really thinking about this as a site, both of real potential threat to the environmental justice communities and the ecological communities in this space, as well as potential opportunities to create more environmental justice and ecological restoration in these spaces. So what do we do? What's our approach to these challenges that I just stated? So we really follow 3 strategies. I'm going to focus in this conversation around the Getting People to Water program that we do. But the other is, water quality repair, which is really focused on restoration and water quality testing and things like this. And then land use equity is more focused on coalition-based organizing around projects that potentially threaten land use equity, but then also around community-based planning to imagine kind of radical futures for these spaces. And we use 4 methods. I'm going to, in this conversation, focus mostly on arts and culture. Getting people to water. So we use a lot of tools to connect people to their natural environment. So dragon boating is a core one. As is the arts. So that's a picture of an exhibit that we did at the Queens Museum over 6 months, where we sort of showcased our approach to stewardship, and then also community cleanups. These are all really fun and wonderful ways of getting people to the water. We use them as organizing tools, and we understand them as organizing tools to foster bonds so that people become advocates and stewards. So they're really in pursuit of our advocacy goals. And so one of those advocacy goals is thinking about how do we improve, how do we restore the habitat that's been so changed around Flushing Meadows Corona Park. And it was mentioned a few times that, once you break the glass, you're not going to put the glass fully together. So instead of thinking about how do we put the glass fully together, think about what are some changes that can actually be realistic and be potentially transformative in the present. So we're really focusing on this area around of Flushing Creek. So Flushing Creek goes underground for about half a mile. And above it is 2 soccer fields and a mini golf course. In the middle is a fountain, and that fountain is Flushing Creek water. Fun fact, it used to be operating and it would spray bacteria at everyone, and so they turned it off. And so we're really focusing on that area. What could we do? So I'm going to show you a couple of maps. Unfortunately, these are not like the best pictures of these really amazing maps because they're found in the Queens Museum archive by a Queens Museum staff member who just sent them to me. And I was like, I have to show you all, but we don't have great scans yet. But this is a map of the historic Flushing Creek in 1934. And what you might be able to see, and I'm actually going to come away from the mic for a second. What you might be able to see is the meandering path of the historic Flushing Creek flowing here, and then actually the park's design laid on top of that. So you can see how it's going to be shifted from being this historic path. And this picture is so amazing to me. Then you can see the progress of that evolution of transforming this space. So you can see that meandering creek really became these 2 lakes, Willow Lake here, just out of focus, and then Meadow Lake. And then you can see the path moving here. So this is the fountain that I had mentioned earlier. And then this was then covered by the soccer fields. So we're, daylighting was mentioned before as this potentially really transformative tool for opening up these covered waterways and physically restoring them. Army Corps of Engineers actually looked at this site as a potential opportunity for that kind of restoration, and ultimately decided, along with the city, that they were going to look elsewhere along the Flushing Creek and Flushing Bay watershed for restoration opportunities, because this was just too difficult. There was just too much of an impact to public use to really make it feasible. That, to us, we think of as a big water decision. Without actually talking to communities, doing community outreach, doing community engagement, or doing a feasibility study, they made a decision to look elsewhere. That's fine. We're really interested in a process right now that's going on for resilience planning of Flushing Meadows Corona Park that's led by the Waterfront Alliance with federal funding from Grace Meng's office, to look again at this space. What's possible here? And actually, before we do the restoration feasibility study, let's do a community engagement effort. So we're focusing on the concept of daylighting, but actually in the concept of daylighting in terms of cultural daylighting. So, which just means rather than physically opening up the water, let's reveal the water through arts and culture practices. So we're partnering with the Queens Museum. If you haven't guessed so far, we have a good relationship with the Queens Museum. We love working with them. And we're leading a series of workshops that works to just expose the path of these waterways. So we've done sort of a pilot run of that. We worked with 4 different artists in a lot of different capacities. So poetry, social practice, visual art, natural dyeing. Then the last one with natural dyeing is on Sunday for anyone who's interested. And really as ways to bring folks into the conversation. And really one of the biggest impacts of that process is before the workshop, if you've ever been to the Queens Museum, they have a massive panorama built by Robert Moses and his team of New York City. And I do an impromptu, unsolicited, sometimes unasked for, tour of the panorama in terms of the water that flows there. And then I invite people to come to the workshop. And really people from that process are like, wow, I had never thought about it this way. I didn't know that, or pretty excited. I mean, for the most part, some people are like, shut up, Rebecca, but to get on the tour. So it's been a learning experience for us and community members. And then we're going to actually have a 5th workshop that's going to be our concluding workshop in August, where we'll have some panelists who will also talk about Tibbetts Brook and the work that was done there, because cultural daylighting was also a tool that's been used in that whole process over the course really of 30 years. So we're excited to have that conversation. Thanks.
We'll start off with a couple of questions and a discussion, and then take some from the audience, both online and in the room. Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Alan, recently the city announced a really kind of staggering number of investment that will go into green infrastructure that will also be able to be used for manage relocation, let's call it right now. Just curious if you guys have started thinking about what some of the biggest challenges are going to be in spending that amount of money.
So I think the challenges in terms of spending are probably, not too many. We have a lot of opportunity, as I've mentioned, to go beyond the existing investments in green infrastructure. But we also, do have to think about some of the existing challenges that we've been up against, which includes the fact that New York City is extremely highly developed, and already when we're citing green infrastructure, we have limitations, large limitations in terms of fitting it into the public right of way in particular. So we have to consider the subsurface conditions when citing green infrastructure, bedrock conditions. We have high groundwater conditions. We, of course, have underground utilities and subways and all sorts of things. So again, you do run out of space in certain places, but that's where, as I mentioned during my presentation, you have to go beyond, the sidewalks. You look into what you can do in the streets, using permeable, surfaces. You utilize open space as much as you can, and you utilize subsurface. So you're really, having to get creative to spend those dollars. But personally, I don't see it being too much of a challenge in terms of the opportunity that's still available.
And it's 3.5 billion, correct? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges I should mention, though, is that is specific to Clean Water Act compliance. So again, I mentioned during my presentation that the process of working with the regulators to expand the definition of green infrastructure to include cloudburst management and include separately sewered areas is really important, because we don't want to just solve for one problem at a time. So combined sewer overflow has been the problem that we've been solving for with green infrastructure. But moving forward, we want to be able to, it to be like combined sewer overflow and flooding, water quality and flooding, and community benefits and public engagement. So that, of course, is a challenge as well. The more layers you add, of course, the more engagement you have to do. And in a city on the size of New York, trying to reach every person is a challenge. But that's why we're working with you, Amy, and with others to really try to figure out how do we thread this needle. We're not going to get it perfectly, but as much as we can strive to include all the benefits and include all the people, we've got to set the bar pretty high.
Thank you. Eric, Rebecca and I were at a meeting the other day about Casino Park. There was actually two meetings, and she was at the first one that went very smoothly. And then we had one in the evening where a bunch of residents came and were very, very, very passionate that they are feeling misunderstood and ignored from the city over a period of time. And we know the city is beginning to start thinking about this. And in the beginnings of those conversations, we told a story that was similar to yours. And they very passionately decided that, no, that's actually not the reason why they're flooding, and had, evidence and a lot of personal experience in understanding the sewers underneath and how the sewers are constructed. So wondering, how far can your data go to help communities and help the city understand what the problems really are?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to chat with the people you were chatting with. Yeah. My feeling is that when you walk people through the maps, there are historical maps of the city, so you can actually see the city changing through time. and you can see the streams a little bit like Rebecca was just showing. You can see, well, there was the stream, and there was the farm next to the stream, and then there was the factory next to the stream that polluted the stream, and then it was this noisome, nasty thing that then they filled in. And then it starts raining, and it starts raining a little bit more, starts raining a little bit more. If you just sort of walk them through the story of that landscape until you get to a point where they're living in it, then that helps them understand. I think an important point about the stormwater infrastructure of the city is it was built at a particular point in time. That point in time is a little bit different in different parts of the city, obviously. But with an understanding of the technological capacity and the climate of that time. And so, you know, someone was built in the 1890s, right? We had a different climate in the 1890s. The pipes were built at a certain size. It's very difficult to make the pipes bigger, right? And very, very expensive and very disruptive. If you read the New Normal report that came out at the end of the de Blasio administration, it makes this point very clearly about just, you know, the hundreds of billions of dollars it would take and the like massive disruption over decades to redo the built stormwater infrastructure. So, you know, I think we definitely need systems that can adapt as the climate changes. And I think nature tells us how to do that. And the history of the city helps everybody understand why that is. I think my only critique of what the city does now, and actually a lot of our activities is, of course, we're listening to everybody who's around us. We're just thinking about our moment. But our moment is in a historical progression where it's based on the decisions that were made by our grandparents and our parents and, you know, us. And we are creating that context for the future. And so I know it's hard because the people of the future don't exist, but we have to be thinking about them if we're going to get through this massive change to the Earth system and what it means for our little piece of it.
Thank you. And Rebecca, you and I share this passion for communities and organizing and understanding and really listening. I'm wondering if you have any experience seeing a really good engagement process, maybe not from your, from your organization, but either in New York City or somewhere else. And if you could describe what was so good about it in ways that maybe the people here can take it back. We have a lot of city agencies here.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that DCP's Department of City Planning's comprehensive, sorry, I'm like joking a little. I thought that DCP's comprehensive waterfront plan process was pretty successful. You know, I think it's a little difficult because the plan doesn't have teeth. So there's only so far it can go. And maybe it makes it a little easier to do like a really deep community engagement process when there isn't teeth attached. I don't really know, but I really thought first of all, I thought the agency genuinely wanted to understand how to do engagement well. They reached out to a lot of groups to understand how to do engagement well in that process. And I think in general, something that can go awry in a community engagement process can be, I don't want to speculate on the root of it, but a lack of transparency around what the city's really able to do ultimately. And then it's sort of like changing expectations where actually at the end of the day, it's so worth it to just be super transparent and say, actually, that's not gonna happen. You know, like we can't do that. And like, just to be real with communities about that. As they're adults, you know, or sometimes they're not, but they're still like ready to handle that information. So yeah, so DCP's process, I think they had over 100 meetings. They did a ton of deep outreach. It was on the ground. It was in small groups. It was at different stages of listening. It was also like small conversations with organizations. It was bigger conversations in community. And yeah, I thought ultimately also what came out of the plan in general, I really combed through that plan, were a lot of really helpful tools that we could then use and point to and say, you know, coastal risk districts, let's talk about it. Like, how do we apply that in other areas? Like that was actually very useful to our community group.
And I think when the city is transparent about what they can't do, it really gives an opportunity for the community leaders to take that in and have a reality check. And it kind of sets it at a very good tone. So I think that's really a great perspective. David, you have a perspective from all around the world now that you've been working in. Wondering what are the maybe few big lessons and advice you would give to New York City?
It's interesting. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for 7 years. I haven't lived in Singapore, but have been spending a lot of time there and have had conversations with members of the leadership in New York about the 2 cities or the 3 cities. Singapore's a little bit easier to engage now. They're more forward at the UN, et cetera. But, you know, they're at very different stages. My takeaway is if you want to look at density and get into how buildings might be able to absorb nature-based systems, Singapore is doing a lot of that. They have much more radical codes that permit that and financial and development incentives to do it. But I'm skeptical. The measurement systems and whether they're actually contributing to the ecology is kind of a little bit murky. You could see it as a lot of green bling. So the performance character, you know, so it's a great step because it gets the social consciousness and it's really branded that way. They have great slogans to go with it, like a graphic design campaign that really heightens awareness about what the buildings might, as a myth, be doing. We don't know if they're actually doing that, but you know, it's a great step, and it really understands that you're going to run out of X, Y. You have to engage the Z at some point and think about that in the aggregate. Whereas I think New York's been much more sophisticated about the X, Y, but is only now just starting to tap into the Z. And that because of our politics and financial structures, that's also one of the most challenging zones because it's seen as proprietary, private, and off limits. So you get these encampments. It's difficult to regionalize that. And, you know, Singapore can do that because of its politics. That's a lot harder in a democratic capitalist system. So you know, I don't, those are some takeaways, I guess, and observations that I would say. And you know, they should talk more. I think we should be talking a lot more because there are things to learn from one another and from the communities that live in and practice in those spaces. There's also tremendous, I mean, the cyberport, the Pak Phulam village and how they use that space and how we've learned from them is just radical. I mean, it's super interesting. Dragon boats is like the tip of the iceberg. These are people who live in these risk zones, fish in them, and tinker with flooding on a regular basis.
When I worked in the city about 15 years ago and worked there for a long time, it was almost impossible to show the city an example from Europe or from Asia and try and say, oh, why don't we do that? But the city has really come pretty far and has these incredible relationships that are quite deep with many, many cities around the world on many topics. So let's go to if there's any questions in the audience or online. Great. So we're going to wait until the mic comes to you. So the people online can.
Thanks so much for all the great presentations. Related to your point about green bling, I guess a question for Alan. With all of these different strategies to address pluvial flooding, how do you quantify progress towards preventing flooding? And like, what are the key metrics that, you know, we could look at year to year to see if all these things are making a difference?
It's a really good question. I think it's something we're still trying to figure out. The Green Infrastructure Program has used, you know, volume and area managed as metrics, but now, you know, we're looking at the flood maps that we've established and how much we can actually reduce those flood depths. Those maps reflect, you know, storms that exceed the design capacity of the sewer. So, you know, we're getting into territory where we can't necessarily solve for every issue, but for the first time, we're trying to essentially model the impacts of green infrastructure and nature-based systems on reducing flood depths in the city. So, you know, that's the primary metric right now. It's kind of emerging as a, you know, in terms of the technology, even like for us being able to take our models that we've used and built out over the years to specifically figure out, how much is discharging at the end of the pipe of the combined sewer. And then we add layers to that. We take the one-dimensional pipe model, we add the surface. So you're then getting this, what's called 1D, 2D representation of the city. We have to run these pretty sophisticated models to look at, how much our green infrastructure based programs can actually reduce those flood depths. So hopefully in the future, there will actually be more simplistic ways to approach this. I think we can, advance this. We just haven't had a lot of guidance because it seems to be an emerging topic. So much of what's happening at FEMA, for example, has been focused on coastal flood risk. So the more help we can get on this topic of including the pluvial flood risk and quantifying the ways that we can reduce it, the better. We really do need resources on this topic.
And Eric in his presentation kind of mentioned, but went pretty fast, talking about the city's 311 maps. And after Hurricane Ida, the city really didn't know where it flooded and to what extent, and had to go back and try and figure out what are all the data points that could lead the city to a somewhat of an understanding of what happened. And the 311 maps are really essential in that process, but we actually don't know if are complete or not. So I think part of the challenge that DEP faces is also, even when we figure out how much rain we have stored, is how will we know if we're putting a big enough dent in the problem?
Can I add one quick
Please.
thing? That triggered, the FloodNet program and being able to actually that is looking at, some of you in the group here might be able to describe it better than I can, but that is actually looking at the what's happening on the grounds and how much flooding is actually occurring. So we have to take data from 311, from creative ways of using technology, but then also working with the public to record what's actually happening, because it's one thing to model it, but then to ground truth it, I think is another emerging topic.
It's maybe worth saying that there are going to be a number of natural experiments in our future where we're going to get these big flood events, and then we'll see who loses property and who dies, and how much disruption there is based on, the way the actual storms run out.
Which is unfortunately a horrible way to find out this information.
Yeah.
There was a question that Karina had.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. This was a packed session. It's a lot of information there. Two questions about kind of the ideas of kind of collective individual action. In this green infrastructure investments, first of all, are there financial investments or incentives for homeowners and developers to implement, pervious materials and green infrastructure in their own private property? And the second thing is, and this might be wrong, right? But I'm just gonna say it anyway. Is there also an interim discussion about the combined sewer outflows, about behavioral changes in the interim, about water usage during or immediately preceding or during major rainfall events, and trying to really get that message across? I know that it's something that we thought about a lot as when I was a child, but more from a freshwater perspective, which is not, but that seems to be something that could be very effective. I was just curious about that.
So yes, there are incentives in place. The Green Infrastructure Grant Program that I mentioned before has been in place for some time, but there are limitations in terms of the ability of the city to spend public dollars on private property. So there's legal stipulations and minimum thresholds for retrofits. So that program has been evolving. There's the Resilient NYC Partners program, which is doing more in the way, and some of my colleagues can speak better to this, but of offering actual technical assistance and implementing the retrofits, so that it's, not just the transfer of funding. So there's certainly room for that all to evolve, but also limitations with the way, the funding is set up for public dollars. So we, again, look to other cities. I think it's really important because there's innovation happening beyond New York City on that topic in particular. But then we, of course, have to adapt it to what we can do here. But the more we can pull in partners on that, the better. On the behavioral change, I felt like that was a cue to talk about what the WAIT program that we developed. It's an app which you can download right now called Wait ... I think if you don't put in the ...
Is that WAIT or WEIGHT?
WAIT ... And I believe that if you put it in like that, it'll pop up on your phone. But the idea of that is it's like a peak demand messaging app. So similar when there's a peak in energy demand during the summer, Con Ed will reach out and ask users to reduce their energy demand. This is a communications tool that will let people know, hey, there's heavy rain, there's potential combined sewer overflow. Wait to use discretionary uses of water in your house until after the rain event is over. So we don't anticipate that it would necessarily stop the combined sewer overflow, but it's creating those linkages. And I do want to mention, this is not our idea. The Newtown Creek Alliance, I think, was
Cool.
the one that came up with this, or maybe they learned about it from somewhere else. But we do want to rely on, again, I mentioned cities, but then also nonprofit partners and community groups for these ideas as well.
2 questions regarding the app. What is the city doing to let people know that it exists, and how does it, what is the interplay between that and Notify NYC, which is the emergency management app that our city has, which still only has 20% of New Yorkers on it?
It's a great question. We, to be completely honest, haven't done a whole lot of outreach on letting people know that the app is there. We still have opportunity, I think, to do more with that. But hopefully you can spread the word today. And then, we do want to create, I think there could be opportunity as well with things like Notify NYC, but we do want to be clear, I think, that there's a difference, between an emergency situation and this, which is creating this awareness in terms of combined sewer overflows. So those, I think, synergies are there, and we can explore them more, but to date, we haven't done a lot to leverage them.
We have one from online. Oh, great.
So this is an online question from Andrew Gills. Are pluvial flooding hazards and stormwater infrastructure / green infrastructure eligible for FEMA / state flood mitigation funding? Or is urban drainage a local government function with some access to senior government infrastructure funding programs versus flood mitigation funding programs?
It's a good question. Alan, I don't know if you have the answer. We also might have some people in the audience that might know the answer, like Karina. So
My, I guess, simple response to the question is yes. We've been applying, and we've received some funding through the FEMA BRIC program. It's Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities for our cloudburst projects. The first one was a partnership with New York City Housing Authority at Clinton Houses in East Harlem. So we were able to demonstrate that we could go through the FEMA benefit costs analysis and reduce the flood depth and damage sufficiently to qualify for that funding. So FEMA has been doing a lot of great things to promote, proactive investment in hazard mitigation, and yes, it's we've been able to demonstrate that type of work we're doing can qualify. I think sewer upgrades and other projects are a challenge, though, because of the timeline for implementation assigned to federal funding, amongst other things. They're much longer term efforts.
and some other funding sources might be FEMA's HMGP program, which would be eligible, and also the dollars that we got or are getting from the federal government from Hurricane Ida, which are always an opportunity. Do we have any, where are we? Maybe I'll take one more and then I have a last question for each of. There's a- yeah, we have two in the front. Can we combine them? Please speak in the microphone so people online can hear.
Hi, Ellen. I would like to know if the water bill is itemized, because that was one of the challenges to address or at least quantify grants.
So the question is if the water bill is itemized,
Yes,
meaning.
what portion of it is stormwater management, what portion of it is sewer?
So right now it's water and sewer. So stormwater and wastewater are lumped into one. That is something we are looking at right now. We're doing a sustainable rate structure analysis, as you may know, which is looking at the impacts of potentially separating the stormwater charge from the sewer charge. So it would be itemized. And then potentially charging people based off of their imperviousness, which would be new. Right now, the entire bill is linked to your water usage. So again, great example of looking at what other cities are doing, but then we have to study specifically what the impact is on New York City ratepayers before we move forward with that sort of change.
Sure,
Sometime.
go ahead.
Well, mine's kind of like a broader reflection question. This presentation hit very close to my heart, so loved everything that was presented today. But I'm thinking back to the way you framed the conversation, Amy, and would love to hear the panel's like reflection coming from like Sandy 10 years ago and how that really brought in a lot of coastal resiliency conversations. And now with Ida, the focus on pluvial flooding and just like the transformation over the past like 15 years of conversations in New York around climate change and resilience. And I'm just curious how this has like, how Ida maybe in particular has changed your work at all, if it's brought more pressure to like addressing these problems faster or relief, having more funding coming your way, more attention on it. So I just would love to hear kind of like your thoughts on that.
It's such a great question. Maybe we can go down the line relatively quick and then we'll have one last one. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's been a journey, and I think one that nobody really knew we were getting into from the beginning. So this week, Rebuild by Design hit its 10th anniversary, which is pretty remarkable. And as part of the 10th anniversary for Hurricane Sandy, we did a lot of reflections and work with community groups around the city to reflect and to think about what we should be doing next. And I think the city has come an enormous long way. But it was those steps between, Sandy, and then I would say it's probably Sandy and then heat, I would say. And then the next would be rain events. However, there's still so much more we need to do. And there are so many different governance and budgetary structures that have to be undone in order to actually have a united approach to address a lot of these issues. So we're still at the beginning. Maybe we can go from David and on, give Alan a little break.
I mean, I lived here in the 90s and then in LA and Asia and have circled back. So it's been an interesting journey to see how different governments and building in each of those regions deal with water and water consciousness differently. I think one of the big differences that I see is Sandy provoked a lot of interest in mitigation and defense. I think Pluvial is, you have no choice but to adapt. You can't run away from it. It's everywhere. So I think that really shifts the discussion and hopefully the money, but it's not a line. All those maps today, it's like a rhizome that's going to happen wherever it's going to happen. And I think that is freakier, maybe in a good way.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm sort of thinking about it in terms of like projects. So right now there's the HATS, the harbor, I can't, I'm blanking. The tributary study, and with the Army Corps of Engineers. So really looking, and that's really responding to Hurricane Sandy. and really responding to the money that came from that. And so it's really focused on defense. It's really focused on storm surge barriers at the shoreline. How do we protect from storm surge in the future? So, the tentatively selected plan is a plan that has a bunch of storm surge gates throughout small tributaries like Flushing Creek that would close in major rain events. So you have that. And then next to that, you have sort of DEP's cloudburst study is another good example of coming out of Ida, really looking at like so much attention being focused in Flushing, in College Point, in East Elmhurst, in the communities that experienced a lot of flooding from Hurricane Ida. You have these two different types of responses. And I think, there's a lot of, it feels, looking at the HAT study can feel complicated because the issue is that they're not looking at it holistically. Like that's been a lot of the concern coming out of our group and then a bunch of tributary groups throughout the city has been, it's not a holistic look at the overwhelmed sewer system, about rainfall, about sea level rise, about groundwater. And, how do we actually meld these plans together and make sure that we're still we want all the federal money, like we still want all of that money coming, but how do we make sure they're actually integrated? Yeah.
Well, my experience is after Sandy, I wrote a lot about how the places that flooded were the old salt marshes of the city. There's like a 90% overlap between the maps. And the response I mostly got back was, oh, well, that's not surprising. And we're not going to move back from the coast. And a decade later with Ida, it was pluvial, it was places that people didn't expect to flood. And the attitude was completely different. I live on a little hill on City Island and it flooded in our basement, not terribly, but enough that was like, that's really weird. And it's because we got a month and a half of rain in 6 hours on top of City Island and City Island just couldn't absorb all that water. And then in the news that was coming afterwards, it was like, oh, people died here and oh, that's Rock Hollow Pond, or people, lost all this property. Oh, that's Casina Creek. And then you remember that video of the water coming into the 28th Street subway station, just like a river? Well, there's a wetland where that river was, right? That you can see on maps from the 1780s. So, so I wrote a little op-ed about that was in the Times and people, and that was because people were calling me and asking, and every time they would call, I would say, oh yeah, well, look, actually there was a stream there, or, it was a pond. And I think the zeitgeist has changed. I think we've gone from, the sustainability, which was the main mantra, Plan NYC before Sandy, and then immediately like the day after it was all about resilience and like, rebuilding. And I think we are in the process of renaturing our city.
The dynamic in terms of thinking about nature-based systems, green infrastructure, not just as combined sewer overflow mitigation, but as flooding changed after Ida, but it also, I think has created this need for a discussion, more than a discussion, but communications about, what the sewer can do, what green infrastructure can do, what cloudburst management can do, and then what property owners are responsible for. And then this dynamic in terms of, given multiple options for areas of repetitive flooding, do we build our way out of it and use traditional tools, pumping, etc., sewers, or do we, look at retreat or other options building up? So this is all happening in real time, but I don't feel like it was happening before Ida.
Can I say vegetation is the traditional solution and sewers is the new solution?
If we can get that on a t-shirt, that would be great. So I want to bring it back to retreat, and it'll be a quite a hard one, I think, that we'll end up with. So please, whoever's ready to speak first, go ahead. Curious to know from all your perspectives, what indicators the city should use to determine where to invest and where to retreat?
Eric and I may have totally opposing thoughts about this, but I think the first place to retreat that we should be looking to rework is landfill, not the ridges. This is where, as you pointed out, that's where a lot of the inequities are. That's not only in New York
Mm-hmm.
City, you see it in all the cities that I've seen, and it is a blurry zone more than a line that has a lot of questions about how you might manage the, the combined, because you get lots of pluvial action and lots of vulnerability to storm surge and other things in those zones. So, yeah.
Interesting. Who's up next?
You don't have to go in a line.
No.
Okay, well, I mean, I think you all know what my answer to this question is, that, places that were wet in the past, the nature has not forgotten about those places. They're going to continue reworking them. So living on barrier islands doesn't make any sense in New York City. Living in stream beds doesn't make any sense in New York City. Living in former salt marshes and wetlands doesn't make any sense. And I would just urge us all to be thinking about this, not just what it means for the people today, but what does it mean for the city 20, 50, 100 years from now? The population pressures, the issues will be different then than they are now. If we really believe that New York City as an entity should exist in the future and is a desirable thing, we need to be thinking about what makes the city an attractive place to live 100 years from now. In the way, I worked for an institution that was founded in 1891. Those people were thinking 100 years from now, what can, the New York Botanical Garden be giving to the city, right? And it's not gonna be the same thing it was giving in 1891. So, we need these like institutional structures that make the city a desirable, attractive, livable, wonderful place to live for all the reasons that we love it, the cultural activities and the economic opportunities, and the opportunity to be with nature. And I really think that this is our time to be the Robert Moses of the future, if you like, but a positive Robert Moses that is about creating a city that's going to last for hundreds of years instead of just, trying to shackle us in chains with the automobile like the way he did.
Eric, I noticed that you didn't say if it makes sense to live in City Island. Did you purposely leave that off?
No. Well, so City Island I live on a hill that's 40 feet high. That's right. So
We'll all be taking our boats to visit you one day.
someday we will be waterfront property. Yes, that's right. That's right. It doesn't all have to happen at once. I mean, obviously, the places that are most in danger are the places we should concentrate on first. Yeah. So my neighbors down the hill, yeah, they should worry.
I can add a little bit, just basically repeating, that historical flooding and is a really great indicator of some of the areas in the work that Eric's been doing on looking at where there's potential opportunities for the future. I think is really important. So again, when we develop maps through very complicated modeling, they look a lot like that, but that's another good indicator of where we're going to be seeing repetitive flooding. I think it ultimately culminates for us, at least for me, I should say, in what are the alternatives? You have to have a starting point. There's almost always some sort of gray infrastructure alternative, but how much is that going to cost? And I think you have to sometimes look at the least favorable options sometimes to figure out, is that actually what the long-term investment should be in this area? So you have to start somewhere. I'm not sure if that's really making sense, but a lot of the, analyses I think we're doing in areas that have repetitive flooding is seeing, well, using the tools that we have, what would this look like? And then you can, advance the discussion about, is that actually the preferred alternative for that community?
I suspect it's going to be very hard to have a cost benefit conversation with people who live there. I think that's going to be probably the hardest argument that you could possibly use is the cost. Maybe it would be the disruption of what it would take to actually build it. I don't know. We haven't tried. But Rebecca, last word.
Yeah, I think, you all are at a managed retreat conference. It is such a complicated and thorny and emotional conversation for communities. And Corinne's question is still kind of like resonating for me. I mean, just thinking about as a community group that represents communities who really experienced more pluvial flooding than coastal flooding because of their position inland. The impact of Ida was highly emotional. Like when you talk about people dying in their homes, you have to talk about it really delicately in, anywhere, but really in the places where I work. It's an emotional, delicate conversation. So I think in the same vein, talking about uprooting people from their homes, especially in communities that are distrustful of government because of government's impacts on them for a long time, and distrustful of planning because of planning's impacts on them for a long time. It's emotional, and it should be. And so I think something that was really compelling to me in this meeting that Rebuild by Design led the other day, just to give you all a pitch, is that I thinking about how do we find opportunities if communities do need to move, where they can actually move within their existing community, so there isn't this like root shock that happens from gentrification, from displacement, and keeping them within their communities. And then I think the other side of that question for me is when we're talking about landfill, when we're talking about historic floodplain, those are a lot of the places where the city is currently enabling large scale luxury developments. Those are being enabled in those areas. So I really agree that we shouldn't be enabling them. So then when we say, let's talk about managed retreat for some communities, but simultaneously build these massive luxury developments in the floodplain, comes across rightly so as hypocritical, and again fosters this distrust in local communities of the government and policy decisions. So
And inequities
of
who gets to live and who gets to stay and who gets to come.
Yes.
And thank you for the plug. We are going to be, I'm going to be presenting our report about New York City displacement at 1:30, and we are really looking at displacement or getting ahead of displacement as an anti-displacement strategy. Like how are the ways that we can all work together to ensure that we do have space for our neighbors and people have choices to live nearby instead of having to leave and go very far. So thank you, panelists. Really appreciate it. Thank you, audience.